Minecraft just reintroduced chunk loading for the end dimension without a player. Hello there, Ray here. I'll show you how the end dimension chunk loading works and what cool farms and machines can use it. Not being able to load parts of the end dimension without a player there was possible in the past, and I was the first person to discover this, which was over 8 years ago. But when 1.13 was introduced, it broke this chunk loading. But now it's been reintroduced for Java versions starting in version 1.20.5 and above. Normally when you're playing Minecraft, you're loading an area around the player. This way you can actually see what's around you and different things can occur in this area. And if you would move, this area that you're loading will move with you. That way your computer doesn't have to struggle to try to show everything possible in your Minecraft world all at once. It only has to show what is around the player. And what it will actually show you can be determined by your render distance. By making it higher, you're able to actually see further out, but it doesn't mean that things way out there will actually work, because this is ran by the simulation distance. So if we would drop this all the way down to just 5 chunks, which means 5 chunks beyond the chunk where I'm standing in a big square is the area where stuff can happen, like mobs moving around, fire burning things, and anything that kind of moves and feels alive inside your Minecraft world. I'll talk more about simulation distance as well as render distance in an upcoming video, which I'll link in the description once it's out. And because this area moves with the player, that means the area that you just left is now going to be unloaded for your game. And this is why it's normally not possible to load chunks without a player, because when you leave the area or go into a different dimension, everything that you had loaded before will unload completely from the game and will just freeze in the last position that you've seen it. So if we could automatically load chunks without the player, we could do a lot of cool things. And the way we can chunk load is actually pretty easy. All you need to have is a entrance end portal, which has these portal blocks in it. And then anytime an entity goes through that portal block and makes it over into the end dimension, it's going to load an area around it. You can tell if something's an entity just by turning on hitboxes by pressing F3 plus B. And if you see this little line around something, it's an entity and you are one as well. And when an entity goes through the portal, the amount of time it's going to load the other dimension is for 15 seconds after it went through. And we can actually detect this as I have some commands which are actually telling what's going on in the other dimension without us having to be there. So let's go over and see exactly how big an area it's being loaded. So first off, when you come over here to the end dimension, you are placed in the very center of this obsidian platform. And everything you send through will also be placed there. So if we go ahead and turn on the chunk borders, you guys can see the edges. This is what a chunk actually looks like. It's 16 by 16 and it goes from top of the world all the way down to the very bottom. And this is how the game can load parts around you without loading everything. It just sees how many of these little squares it needs to put around you and then just removes any of them that are so far out away from you. And since our initial entity that we threw the end portal landed here, it is technically inside of this chunk. And once it comes through, it not only will load this chunk, but it'll also load a band of chunks all the way around it. They're colored green because these are some of the most useful chunks. This is where entities can do stuff, such as like mobs can grow up. They're able to walk around in here and pathfind, and things like items can despawn and get moved by water, which has a lot of cool uses, which we'll look into later. Now, just because it is entity processing doesn't mean that crops will grow, because this is actually done by random ticks, which only occur around where the player is standing. The red ones are just outside the green ones. These are the block processing or redstone processing. Block processing is anything to do with blocks. So blocks can change, like you can see this repeater can turn on and off. Pistons can retract and extend. Blocks can change states, like these rails can turn on and off. But when it comes to actual entities, if they get moved into these chunks here, as soon as they end up over here, since this is only a redstone processing chunk, it cannot process entities. So what will happen is the game will just stop the entity from moving and it won't process any more of its movement. So the minecart will just be stuck on the edge like this. Where entity processing chunks can move both entities and blocks, but the block processing can only do blocks. And then the set of chunks that are just beyond the block processing ones are these ones out here colored in gray. And these are mob cap processing, meaning that they can keep track of if there's mobs out here. The mobs themselves won't be able to move around, but this area will still be loaded in just enough to know that there is mobs out here and it's able to count them up. So with these 3 shulkers here, we can actually notice these shulkers. If we look in the F3 menu in Java Edition, this M means monsters, and we can see that there is currently 3 monsters. And if we would add another one, now you can see there is 4. this ability to see what type of creatures are in your game. So even if the chunk isn't entity processing or block processing, but is mob cap processing, these mobs here could prevent us from actually getting more mobs to spawn in our world naturally. And in these type of chunks, the entities won't be processed or the blocks. So as you can see from the center outwards, the chunks become less and less useful and more restricted. So the best type of chunk are these here, the entity processing ones. And every time one entity gets dropped into the end dimension, this is the area which is going to be loaded. So we're going to get a total of 9 of these entity processing chunks. Then a row of redstone processing, then mob cap processing, and then beyond all of this is the unloaded chunks. I illustrate these with some black blocks. This just means that the game isn't loading these at all. So now that you understand the basics of how chunks are loaded around the player as well as around any type of entity that comes into the end dimension. Now while I'm standing here, I'm actually loading this as the player. So let's see how this actually looks when I am not here. Put down some chunk analyzing bees. These were made for me by Fax, and what they do is tell what type of chunk they're in. So I got one bee here, and the bee is actually saying this here. It's saying 6,0. This is the number of this chunk. Every chunk in the game is numbered. You can see them up here at 3 screen. There's the 6 and there is the 0. One's the X value, one is the Z value. Then we also have another B, which is diagonal from it, also an entity processing chunk. And this chunk is called 5, -1. So this B here is saying 5, -1. It's also saying what type of chunk it's in, entity processing. And then we also have another B, which is a bit further out in this ring over here. This B is number 4, -2. But you can see 4, -2 says it's an entity processing chunk, and that's because I'm here. So what I want to do is I want to leave, and then we'll see what it says. Now I also have another B that's a little bit further out, and one that's even further out over here, which should be in unloaded chunks. So we should never see this number pop up, which is 2, -4. So let's go ahead and leave the end dimension. So once we leave, those chunks are going to immediately unload because the player left that dimension and we don't have anything chunk loading it. If I would go ahead and clear the chat and now we look at it, you can see it's not constantly updating it because all the bees over there are unloaded. So let's go ahead and just drop one item into this portal and see what happens. Item goes through, it's going to load the other side, and all of a sudden we start getting some information. It looks a little bit different than before. We got some different colors here. So we have our B which is in the center, which is called 6,0. We can see that is entity processing chunk. The next B is 5, -1, also entity processing. And then that next one, which was in the redstone processing or block processing, you can see it actually now says block processing and it shows up as red, just like the chunks did. And then the B that's in the next row outwards is the mob cap processing, which is the gray color. And notice that the B that is the next ring outwards doesn't show up here because it's in unloaded chunks, therefore it cannot respond. Now this playerless chunk loading works no matter what type of end portal you put the entities through. So this is the exit end portal, which opens up after you kill the ender dragon. And just by putting items through this portal, it's not going to load this side, but it's going to load the side where these items end up, which happens to be world spawn point. So imagine the items are going out of the exit end portal and then they're landing here at the world spawn point, which is also known as your spawn chunks. And because they're coming through the end portal, they're also loading the 3x3 area of entity processing, as well as the ring of block processing, and the final ring of mob cap processing. And then everything beyond that would just be unloaded chunks. But seeing as any items that go through this portal only end up in your spawn chunks, there's really no reason to load those, as spawn chunks are typically loaded by themselves if there's a player in the overworld. Otherwise, if there's a player in the Nether or the end dimension, they can unload unless you have a chunk loader over there, which you can do more easily by using a Nether portal rather than using this exit end portal. I'll talk more about how spawn chunks work in that upcoming video. So for now, we'll just ignore this portal here and we won't use it for actual chunk loading. So what can we do with chunks in the end dimension being loaded without the player? Well, first off, we can run my automatic sand generator without a player. So before the Java Edition 1.20.5, you would have to have the sand duper. The sand would get duplicated and sent over into the end dimension, but just because the entities were going over to the end dimension, they weren't loading the chunks. So what you'd have to do is have a chunk loader load this machine here, and then you'd have to take the player over into the end dimension. That way you can load the sand so it wouldn't just pile up over here frozen, and then you'd end up with thousands of sands just frozen over here, and then when you would come over here you would load all those entities at once, which would crash your game or the server. because nothing could be processed over here. So you'd have to have the player sitting over here loading everything so it could get processed, broken down, turned into items, and then picked up with hoppers and stored into chests. But now you can actually run my simple sand generator or concrete generator all without a player. Now, because the entity processing chunks end right here, we can't take something like our sand generator and pipe the sand all the way back to spawn, because the exit end portal is typically here in the center. But if you happen to get a glitched end portal, which I showed using this trick here, you can actually get it close enough that's within the entity processing chunk so you can immediately transfer your sand back to spawn. Which means now we can actually run my beacon farm without having to move my player over to end dimension every once in a while or needing a second player. Alternatively, you could just pack up your sand into shulker boxes and then send them off into this water stream. They would pile up and unload, but it's less likely for you to reach some huge number of shulker entities that would actually crash the server before coming over and loading this area so they can continue on their way. The sand generator is creating entities that are being sent over into the end dimension, and they're actually loading the end dimension. We can see this because our B is saying it's entity processing at the coordinates of 103 and 1, which is the obsidian platform over in the end dimension. But we also have this area here being loaded, and that's because we're using my nether portal chunk loaders. So every time an entity comes over into this chunk here, it will load this one as entity processing, as well as all the surrounding chunks, in the same manner as the end dimension loads chunks. So by turning on the chunk borders, we can see the edges, and we know that this chunk is being loaded, as well as another ring outside of it as entity processing. Just happens to be that our entrance end portal is between two chunks. So we need to make sure that both these chunks can process entities, as when the sand falls, it is actually an entity, so it wouldn't get processed in just block processing chunks. And the way that we have items coming out of this nether portal here is that we have a machine on the nether side. So over here we have a slightly different machine, which has a nether portal, and underneath of it we just have a slow clock, which will send out a redstone pulse every 10 seconds. And then when it pulses, it's going to pulse all these droppers here, which is going to move items upwards. And this last dropper here is going to drop the item directly into the nether portal. This will teleport the item over into this side, and since it's moving in this direction, it'll continue flying over here and then falling down into these hoppers. The hoppers then push the items into these droppers, which then also get powered by a observer clock over here, which is constantly sending items all the way up and back up to this top dropper here, which sends the item into the portal, and this repeats the entire process. So the nether side is sending item to the overworld. This is loading the 3x3 chunks of entity processing, which includes loading this machine, which will then send another item back over to the nether, and that item's going to load a 3x3 entity processing area around this portal here in the nether dimension. And because both these portals are loading each other, we don't even have to be here as a player. So if I would just leave this entire area, both nether portals are loading each other, and then one of them is loading the stronghold, which is loading the sand generator, and then the sand generator is loading the end. And we can actually see this in the chat. This big number here is the B that's at the overworld stronghold location. Then the smaller number, which is 8 times smaller, is the B at the nether portal chunk loader. And then the really small number is where the B is over in the end dimension. And if I type in chat, you can see that this is constantly sending updates, letting us know that these chunks are continuing to be updated despite me, the player, not being there. Now, the only time that these chunks will unload is if the server restarts on a multiplayer server, or if you're a single player and you leave the world. So now if we join the world again, all the chunks were unloaded when we left, so now it will only load the chunks around the player. And you can see that we're getting no information from the chunk analyzers. That's because when we unloaded the world, it also unloaded any chunks that were being loaded. That way they could save them properly without any problems. So if we head back over here, we can see that we are now loading the overworld because we are standing here as a player. End dimension's not being loaded because we just happened to unload this machine right as the sand was falling, and it accidentally broke off instead of being captured by the slime. So if we would just put this sand back here again, it'll now start duplicating sand over to the end dimension, once again loading the obsidian platform. We also happen to have the nether dimension unload as well. That's because no items are being sent through this portal yet. So if I would let it drop in one item, now it's going to send it over and load the nether dimension, and this will start the whole cycle back up again. But what if you want to load the end dimension without having problems of unloading? Now, often servers don't restart too often, so once you set this up, it should be good to go. But in single player, you do leave the game quite a bit. So rather than relying on duplicated sand in order to load the end dimension, we can use something that's more consistent. So we can drop items over there. So I just have a dropper which is facing upwards, and it's going to drop a item into the portal every time this redstone gets turned on and off. And I went ahead and connect this directly up to the hoppers over here, so that every time this chunk loader gets activated with the item going through, it's also going to pulse this. I currently have it turned off, so I can turn it on now. So now it will drop an item loading the end dimension using this here. But eventually you're going to run out of items. So there's another way we can do this, and that is by duplicating not sand, but carpets. So I got a carpet duper here, and every time this piston extends and then retracts, it's going to duplicate one carpet, and then the carpet's going to fall into the portal, loading the end dimension. So depending on if your server allows duping or not, you can choose one of these methods to load the end dimension. So now that we have a system to load the end dimension after the chunks are unloaded, how are we going to load this overworld? Well, we're going to do that by loading the nether dimension. So if we go over here to nether dimension, we just have our chunk loader, which is dropping items in about every 10 seconds. And every item that goes through is going to load the other dimension for 15 seconds. So long as the item goes through the portal every 15 seconds or less, it will continue to load the other side. And by setting the timer to 10 seconds, if there's a little bit of lag or latency, item will still get to go through before it completely unloads, which could break some farms like the sand generator. So now we have an automatic way to load the end dimension as well as overworld. The question is, how are we going to load the nether dimension to start this all off? Because if you would leave this area and then leave your world and come back, this chunk here is going to be unloaded. Well, luckily when it comes to the nether, the distance between locations are 8 times closer than in the overworld. If you just travel 1,000 blocks in the nether dimension and then hop over to the overworld, you've traveled 8,000 blocks on the overworld side. So we can use this to our advantage. So I'm over here in our spawn chunks. Then if I go over through this portal, I'm going to end up in the nether dimension. So now I'm actually really close to the other nether portal. So I could throw an item in from spawn chunks over through this portal, which would load this side, plus it would also load the next chunk over. I could set up another nether portal chunk loader where it can send an item through and back over again, and that would load another chunk, and we could continue this until we reach the location of the stronghold, but on the nether side. And you can learn about how to do this portal linking through the nether dimension in this video here, where I use it to actually make a sponge farm in survival. But there's an easier way to load the end dimension after restarting the world. And this has to do with how far the end dimensions actually are. The first ring of strongholds can be found between 10 to 22 chunks away from spawn if you're traveling through the nether dimension. So all we have to do is figure out how far we are from where we're currently working to the stronghold. And then we just hop over to the nether dimension. And then from here, all we have to do is increase our render distance to a distance so we can actually load the initial chunk loader that's on the nether side. So with the render distance turned up, we can actually see that the chunks are being partly loaded. They're only being loaded as mobcat processing. That's because render distance won't make stuff entity processing or block processing, but only mobcat processing. So we're gonna have to go back into our settings and increase our simulation distance. Now on a server, adjusting this won't affect anything in game unless you change it in your actual server settings. But here in single player, all we have to do is increase it. Now we're loading that nether chunk loader. You can see the nether chunk loader also goes ahead and then starts loading the overworld, and then the overworld one starts loading the end dimension, all without us ever having to leave our work area. So now that the two nether portal chunk loaders are loading each other, we can go ahead and drop this back down again, and they'll continue to load each other without us having to load everything. So what else can we use the end dimension chunk loading for? Now we know we can use it for sand generators. We can also switch this out for different gravels and concretes to duplicate those. Now I explain how you can do all this in these videos here, which I'll have linked down in the description. But we can also use this to duplicate dragon eggs, as they're also considered falling blocks. And you can even do some weird stuff like duplicating dripstone points, scaffolding, and even anvils, because all these are considered falling blocks. But we can also take advantage of the obsidian platform. That's this platform here which you spawn on top of when going through the portal. Because every time somebody comes through the portal, they don't want them to fall into the potential void of the end dimension. This platform will actually regenerate the obsidian, which makes up this 5x5 square. So you can mine up the obsidian on this side and then have the clock on the other side drop in a new item to replenish it all. Or you can automatically have the obsidian broken by using withers, which I have several different obsidian farms using withers. You can check them all out in this playlist about wither cages. Now there is a lot of things you could do with the entity processing chunks over here in the end dimension, but since it's a lot easier to make these same type of chunks in the overworld or the nether dimension, it's better to use the overworld and nether rather than trying to use the end dimension. When it comes to like the falling block duplication as well as the obsidian platform regenerating, these are unique to the end dimension and that's why we're using it. But there is another thing that's unique to the end dimension, and that is these gateway portals. And you get one of these portals every time you defeat the ender dragon. And because some of these gateway portals are actually inside of the entity processing chunks of the end dimension, you might be wondering, can we now send items through these portals to load areas out in the outer end islands? Well, let's go ahead and go through this gateway portal. So I have 2 chunk analyzers, and let's go ahead and go on the other side and throw an item through. So if we throw an item through, it lights up as the item gets teleported. And if we look inside of it, we can see that the item did in fact get teleported to the other side. But notice that none of the chunks are actually loading on the other side. That's because the gateway portals don't actually load the chunks over here when items come through. It only works for the end portal and not the gateway portal, which is a different type of block in the game. Now in the past, I did show that it was possible to load through the gateway portals and actually load this area over here. But currently this doesn't work. If it does change in the future, be sure to check the description on any changes to this chunk loading or the previous ones to get the latest information about chunk loading. So you cannot put farms and machines on the other side at these outer end islands, but since the portals do unload stuff immediately, you could actually send stuff over here to end dimension and then push them through a portal and have them get unloaded immediately, such as like a wandering trader, so you don't have to worry about it eventually despawning. Or if you want to make sure a mob stays as a baby form, this is an easy way to get it into unloaded chunks without having to move it all the way to the edge. Great if you're trying to go for the rarest types of mobs in the game. So now I'll do a block by block tutorial on how to actually build up the chunk loaders. So in this example, we're going to be pretending that we want to chunk load our entrance end portal here so that we can run like our sand or concrete or like our obsidian farm on the end dimension. So first off, we need to turn on these chunk borders by pressing F3 plus G. This will tell us where actual portal is compared to where the chunk boundaries are. So we need to make sure to put the chunk loader in one of the chunks, which is actually also containing the portal. So I already built one over here. So the new example one, which I'll be building up, will be over here. Now this is all one chunk. So from that edge all the way to that edge is one chunk. So we can build it way over here up against the edge of this over here, as long as we don't go over. So we're going to start out by building a nether portal here, and we want to build it so that it doesn't connect up with any other nether portals that we are using. So this nether portal is just going to be used for chunk loading, and it isn't going to be used for the player to do maintenance on the actual machine or enter the end dimension. And because of that, we want to make sure that this portal is linked up with its own counterpart portal in the nether dimension. So what we'll do is we'll first come over here and actually pull up our F3 screen so we can see our coordinates, and we're going to use one side of the portal. So let's use this side of the portal, and we're going to stand inside of it and then take a screenshot by pressing F2. Now we're going to load up the screenshot and also a calculator, and we're going to look at the coordinates, which are here in game and are right here in the image. 3 sets of numbers here, and we're going to take the first and the last. The first being 7,621, and then we're going to divide that by 8. Ignore any negative sign. So the new number is this. Then we'll take the third number and also divide it by 8. Then we got this number. So we got both our numbers. These are going to be the new coordinates where we're going to build the portal on the nether side. So let's go ahead and head through this portal here, and we'll probably get linked up with the portal that we have already over there. And we happen to do so, but we want to make sure that our new portal is all on its own and isn't connecting with any other portals. So where the new portal goes is based off of these numbers here. So we're going to pull up our F3 and our coordinates. And we're first going to go to this coordinate here, but remember to add the negative back onto it. So it's going to be negative 952. So let's go ahead and try to move over there. And right here is that location. But if we round this number up, it's going to be 953, which is right over here. Now we're going to go to the Z coordinates, which are at 152.1. If we round that, it's still going to be 152. So let's find 152 here in the nether dimension. So it's right here. And then lastly, we're going to pull up our screenshot, and we're going to get the middle number, which is the Y, and we're going to use that without dividing it by 8, meaning that we're going to build our portal at Y level 26. And we are currently standing at Y level 26, so this is where our portal is going to be placed in, right where I'm standing. And we need to make sure the portal is also facing the same direction as the one in our image. So you can see my character is facing a little bit this direction. And if you look at the directions in the F3, it says I'm facing east. So if we go in game and I stand here and I face east, it's going to be exactly the same. That means the second part of the portal is going to be to just on the right hand side of this. And then we can go ahead and build up the portal around this. And even though it's really close to our other portal, if we did it correctly, this new portal should only link up with our new portal that we built, and the old portals should link up with themselves. We're going to finish building out this nether portal, and then we're going to go ahead and light it. So if we did everything properly, if we come in and walk into this side here, it should connect to the exact same side over here. Notice that we're also facing the exact same direction as we went in and out. At this point, you need to decide what type of chunk loader you want to build. And this will depend on what side you want to load in order to start it. So in my example here, I built this returning station over here in the overworld. And all this part does is will collect any items that come through and immediately send them back. This is different than the other side, which is the side that actually has the brains, being this clock down here. This one determines when to actually send the items, and the majority of the extra items are just sitting in here waiting to be used when their time comes. I would recommend building this version over the nether side so you can easily load it like I showed earlier just by increasing your simulation distance. So this is how I'm going to build it, but you can always build it the opposite and then just be in the overworld to start it up. So first off, we're going to build just this easy return system, which just collects the items that come out of the portal. So we know that they're going to come out and fall this direction. So we have a couple hoppers here to pick them up. We don't want the items to fall outside of this area, so we're going to put in some glass to contain all of the items. We want to make sure to put this glass plenty tall, otherwise the items could end up over top of them, and you don't want to lose items over time, otherwise it will stop. So now that we funneled all the items into the hoppers, these two hoppers go into each other and they're coming over here. From here, we're going to have it push their items into a dropper, then into another dropper, into another one, and the last hopper on top of all of these is going to be facing towards another portal, so it should look like this. And the reason why we have the items go up really high before we shoot them out is so the items don't get stuck on the edge of the portal when they come out of the nether side. So now that we have our nice little dropper elevator, we need to make sure that the items actually go up it. And this is going to take some redstone, so we're just going to come in with a simple observer clock. And this is going to power this dropper and the two droppers that are touching it, these two. So now we can get the items up to about this one. Now we need to get them the rest of the way and out of here and into the nether portal. We're going to do this by connecting up this observer clock by continuing it upwards and then into a note block. To make the note block be quiet, you can just place a block on top of that. Then we're going to come over and place a observer coming out of that note block and into this block here. And then this one will power this one as well as this one, so the items will immediately get moved out of this dimension and back into the other one. Also come in and place a block here just to prevent any piglins from walking out of the portals, because they can randomly spawn inside portals and then kind of make a nuisance by walking about. So now we'll go through this portal and into the nether side, and we'll back out of it and face the same direction as we were looking at the previous one. So once again, we'll imagine the items are coming out of this one and they're going to come into a hopper. So we'll put down a hopper here as well as here, just like the other side, to pick up all the items. And then once again, we want to contain them so they don't go flying all about, so we can make sure we collect them 100% of the time by placing in some blocks around here. You can use whatever blocks you want. Glass is kind of fun to watch at work. And then we're going to do the exact same thing as we did in the overworld by having a dropper coming out, dropper going up, 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 and then the last one's going to be pointing into the portal. So now we're going to put in the brains for this machine. We're going to go over and down from this dropper over here. And then coming out of this block here, we're going to place down 3 comparators facing this way, and then 3 going this direction. We're going to connect these two with some redstone dust, and connect these with redstone dust as well. Then off of this side over here, we're going to have a torch. Then we're going to have a block with redstone. And then the dust will go into this block here, which is then going to be read by this repeater here on full delay, which is going to push its power into this block here, which is then going to put the power into this dust here. And it's going to restart this entire comparator clock. This is the brains of the system, and it will just slowly fade and then turn off, and then turn back on again after about 10 seconds. essentially making kind of a slow clock, which is exactly what we need for operating this portal, as we don't want to send items in all the time. That would just be a lot of extra lag, and instead we'll send them in every 10 seconds, which is just soon enough so that the actual cooldown for the chunk loading won't expire. Then we're going to place in some glass or slabs, and then we're going to link this all up with some redstone. So now when it gets powered, it's going to power all these droppers, moving the items slowly upwards and into the portal. So now to get the system going, we just need to come down here into this dropper right here and put in some items. So use stackable items so you can put more items in there, and also avoid using armor or gear that piglins could pick up, or gold that piglins might try to come in and steal. I'd recommend just go ahead and fill this up. That way you'll have plenty of items in case the one item that you're using to load the other side gets stuck in the other dimension, and then that dimension gets unloaded. It won't ever come back to this dimension, and it will stop the chunk loader from operating. And this is why I wouldn't recommend using minecarts, just because you can't fit as many minecarts, and because you're only using a couple minecarts, the minecarts can get unloaded, and if that happens a few times, you're gonna run out of items and the entire chunk loading system will stop. Alternatively, you could use a clock with some minecarts. That way, if they do get stuck, you can hopefully send in another minecart to try to unstuck the previous one. So now it should be working. We can see that this dropper here is sending an item into the other dimension, and then after a short delay, it's sending the item back over, going the same direction. The reason why I have the items going the same direction, if we would try to send them the opposite direction, items would fly this way, and we could send them through this little gap here to get picked up, but there's a chance of them hitting up against the droppers and getting stuck behind this dropper here. So with this setup here, there's a 100% chance of not losing any items. And it might not hurt to also try to block off these corners as well as on top, just to prevent players from accidentally picking up the items or trying to use this portal to get over into the other dimension. You put in like a sign that also tells people to use the other portal that is nearby. You can see we already got a piglin. And I'll go ahead and close off the corners of this portal here and the top of it. And if you want to turn off the chunk loader, you can just place in a lever about anywhere and then just power it. So just with those two nether portals, you have chunk loaded both of the overworld as well as the nether. Not only the chunk that they are inside of, but also the chunks that surround them, all as entity processing chunks, which is exactly what you need if you're going to be dropping entities into the end portal to load the end dimension. But you can also do a bunch of other things by loading these chunks, which I'll talk about in an upcoming video, which I'll also have linked down in the description when complete. Now my nether portal chunk loaders can work no matter if you have spawn chunks enabled or not. But if you're playing on a modded server, as most servers are modded, it's likely that they did change something to do with portal loading, which could break these chunk loaders. Also, if you're on a server that actually deletes items, over time you might have the items that get shot out of here eventually get deleted, so it's good to have some extras. So if you're having any problems with this not working, make sure to check the world download, as it's working fine here, and it's most likely a problem on your side. I've also provided the schematics or NBTs, which can be used with structure blocks, down in the description, or you can always use the world download to see exactly how I set everything up. Now check out all the cool and fast sand and concrete generators with this playlist here. And thanks to this month's supporters who get tons of perks like having their names at the end of the video. Otherwise, you can always help me out just by leaving a like as well as sharing this video with others. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye!